Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And I, too, just want to thank Skip for all the service he's done here at the center over all the years. And I'll applaud him again. So the theme for this month is spiritual living through creativity. And I wasn't here for the first week here when people came up and just showed all the wonderful ways in which they are creative. And I wish I had been here, but I was speaking at Wellspring. And I still haven't mastered that being in two places at once thing. Which class is that in? So I think we all agree that creativity is a good thing. There are times when it's perhaps not in place, like, for instance, when you're spelling. Creative spellers are not... You like that, huh? Yeah, I've known some creative spellers in my life. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. And I did a little bit of research for this message, and I found out that the concept of human creativity is relatively new. It really took off in the Renaissance. In ancient times, in medieval times, they didn't have the idea that humans are creative. The ancient Greeks had all this art, but their word for art is techne. And the idea was that you used particular techniques. You did it by the rules. You didn't have a lot of freedom in, you can't even say creating your art because they didn't have that word. The closest that they had was a word for to make something. And that is the word from which we get the idea of poets or poetry. They didn't consider poetry to be an art form. They thought of it as something separate. But even there, it was something that was inspired by the muse rather than something that the human themselves created. And then in the Middle Ages, the idea of human creativity, again, wasn't there. It was that if you made something new, that was kind of like the muse. It was divine inspiration. So the idea that we create something really didn't happen until, as I say, the Renaissance. The rebirth is what Renaissance means. I'll begin again. Now, when we think of creativity, you can look to the first chapter of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, although that's one translation among many of that first word, it's the first word. And then Ernest Holmes and many others will look to the English translation and say, in the beginning, God. But that's not the order in which the words appear in the original. That's just the English syntax, the way it has to work. In the original, it's that first word in the beginning, and then the next word is bara, created. So in the beginning, created, and then the next word is God. So created actually comes up even before we talk about God. It's about creating. Now that word, that verb, bara, the only subject that takes that verb is God. Again, humans don't bara. They will make things, they will form things, they will do things, but they will never create in that sense in the Hebrew Bible. Now, when Reverend Bonnie was up here, she made a statement: the thoughts that are put into words have the power to create. And we go back to the book of Genesis, and it seems like, because we're a little sloppy and a little lazy in our reading, that because we read the first part of, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, that all the things that are creating just by God saying them. But that's not so if you actually read what's going on. God always will say something and then do something. He'll form something, he'll make something, he'll place something. It's never just about saying the word and then having something happen. And we're also told, speak your word aloud. And I think the reason that we speak our word aloud is so we can hear it. When you hear your word, when you hear it is what it is that you're saying, and often we don't hear what we're saying, but that's another issue. If you hear what it is you're saying, that activates different centers in the brain. It makes different things happen in your neurology. Now, when we look at the book of Genesis, I had a discussion with a rabbi once. Actually, it's not. We were doing a Bible study, and we started the Bible study, oddly enough, with the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And the rabbi pointed out that unlike other creation stories, other creation myths in the Middle East and other places as well, there's no in those creation myths there's a overcoming the forces of chaos. There's some battle that has to take place. And of course, that does not happen at all in the first book, in the first chapter of the book of Genesis. And I pointed out to him that actually there's a bigger difference in that it's not even a story. Because a story has certain components, has certain requirements. There has to have characters that go through some sort of change, character development. There has to be some sort of conflict, as there are in those other stories. There has to be something at stake. There has to be cause and effect. That is, what happens later in the story comes about because of what happens earlier. And none of that really goes on in that first account. And so I pointed that out. And then later on I thought about it, and I thought, you know, it's really almost as though it's an instruction manual for how to create something. So you start off, what you've got is kind of vague and has no form, it has no substance to it. And so the first thing you do is you turn on the lights so you can see what you're doing. And then you arrange your workspace. You know, you put the mountains here, you put the seas over there. In cooking, chefs call that mise en place. That is, you prepare everything in advance. You put all your ingredients where you'll need them. You put all your utensils where you'll need them so that they're all laid out in advance for when you start doing your cooking. And then the next thing you do is you start doing things in stages. You can't do everything all at once. And so you make sure that you do things in the right order. You create the vegetables before you create the animals, because the animals are going to need, once again, cooking, are going to need to eat the vegetables. And so at the end of each stage, when you've completed that, you review your work, you see if it's good. And then at the end of the final stage, you do a final check. You know, is everything good? Yes, it's all very good. And then you kick back and relax because you're done. And that's the first chapter of the book of Genesis. It's really a way to go about creating. Now, that word that I mentioned before, bara, created, to say it in the future, I will create, would be abra. And if you say, I will create according to my word, that would be abra, I will create, according to ka, the word, dabra. And you end up with abracadabra. And that's where that word comes from. It means, I will create according to my word, as though creation is almost like a magical thing that happens. Now I'm going to talk about the creative process that I know of for two different creative people. One of them is Stephen Pressfield. Stephen Pressfield is an author, former screenwriter, and former many things before that, as most writers do. They have many day jobs before they really take off. And Stephen Pressfield's I think all of his fiction books, maybe except for the latest one, are all about battle and war. One book that he wrote was called Gates of Fire, about the Battle of Thermopylae, which if you've seen the movie 300 and take out all the supernatural stuff, that was that battle. He wrote a book called Tides of War, about the Peloponnesian War. Just about every book he wrote was about a battle or a war, including his first book, which you might be more familiar with. It was called The Legend of Bagger Vance. And even that one is really about battle and war. It's actually an adaptation of the Bhagavad Gita, which may not be apparent, especially if you just saw the movie and didn't read the book. But there are parallels to the Gita throughout the book. Instead of a charioteer, he has a caddy. And instead of a battlefield, there's a golf course. But it's still about battle. The way he approaches things is always about conflict and battle. And so it's not surprising that even his approaching creativity is about some sort of struggle. He wrote a book, a nonfiction book, called The War of Art. rather than the art of war. And his notion is that any creative endeavor does involve some sort of struggle, some sort of battle that goes on with a force that he calls resistance, with a capital R. So he talks about resistance, and he talks about, again, about the muse, as the ancient Greeks did. And that's the struggle that's going on to fight that resistance. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily a way you have to go about creating things, but even with his notion of this thing, resistance, he still uses that as a kind of a compass. What he notes is that if this force of resistance is getting you not to do some particular task, that's the one you got to do. That's the one you got to break through. So I think that he doesn't realize that this resistance is doing something for him, but it still works for him in that way. We talked about the muse and about inspiration and about divine inspiration, and many people think of you have to be inspired in order to create something. And there's a quote that is attributed to many different authors, and I'm going to use the attribution for Somerset Maugham. If you don't know Somerset Maugham, he wrote Of Human Bondage, he wrote The Razor's Edge, The Moon and Sixpence, wrote many, many books. And someone once asked Somerset Maugham if he wrote on a schedule or only when struck by inspiration. "I write only when inspiration strikes," he replied. "Fortunately, it strikes every morning at 9 o'clock sharp." In order to create something, you can't just wait for inspiration. You got to have a certain amount of discipline in order to have any sort of professional kind of creativity. The other creative person I want to talk about is Walt Disney. Him you've all heard of, right? Maybe not all of you. Walt Disney, his creative process was very interesting. He had it into 3 stages, which we can call the dreamer, the realist, and the critic. So the dreamer, when he was going through the first stage, that's what he would do. He would dream. He would visualize. He would sit back, which I'm not going to do because I'm on a stool. He would sit back and just have visions of what it was he wanted to create, whether it was a cartoon or a character like Mickey Mouse, or the first animated movie, Snow White, or all the other movies and television shows and theme parks that he created. It all started with that dreamer dreaming about it. But then it would go on to the next phase, the realist. The realist would plan out how to do it. Now, when Reverend Bonnie was up here last week, and many times before, you'll often hear doing treatment, you treat about the what, and you make a picture of the what, and you dream about the what, perhaps in great detail, but no detail about the how. And that's true about, that's that dreamer part of Walt Disney. But that's true, but we have treat and beat your feet, right? Treat, say the word and then do the doing, and during the doing, that's when you do work on the how. Otherwise, it'll end up always just a dream. So that was Walt's realist part. And then the final part was the critic. The critic, once things were being made, Walt would look at for any flaws, any problems, any things that had to be corrected. And often you hear people say, don't look for that sort of thing. But in programming, that's called debugging. You know, you look for where the problems are going to come up so you can fix them ahead of time. That's what engineers do. If they don't look for the flaws, the bridge will fall down. So that critic is very important to the process. There's a story about the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, not all the movies. When it was first being made, Walt would go over if you've ever been on it, it has different, you go through and there are different places, there are different sections, there's different things going on in different parts of the ride. And Walt would look at every part of the ride and see, does it look right? Does it look the way it ought to look for this particular part? And then he would go through the sounds. Are the sounds for this particular thing what I want, whether it's birds or insects or whatever, the sounds that should be, the gurgling of the water. But then you go on, does it feel right? When you go through that ride, there's different parts of it have different temperatures, different humidity, and he would check, the exact humidity, the exact temperature for each part of the ride. And then does it feel right? Again, the humidity, what's going on there. And at one point, I think it was in the Louisiana Bayou part, he knew that there was something off. Something didn't look right. And what he did was he called everybody in. I mean, everybody, just anybody who would be working at what would become Disneyland, not just the artists, not just the engineers, the mechanics, the groundskeepers, the janitors, everybody. Because that was his way. He thought everybody ought to be a part of the creative process that worked for him. In fact, he said, everyone has to contribute or they become just laborers. So he called them all in, and one of the guys that was sweeping the floor said, I come from that part of the country, and at this time of the evening, there ought to be fireflies. And Walt agreed, and he brought in a whole lot of fireflies, not into the ride, but just because there are no fireflies in California, he brought in a whole bunch of fireflies to see how do they look, when do they, what sequence, how often do they light up, so that they would then come in, then they would make the firefly things to emulate that. That's that critic part. That's that get it right. And if you go back, get into that book of Genesis, it's, you say the word, let there be this, let there be that. That's the dreamer. And then there's the realist, then there's the actual doing. And then there's the critic. Check your work. Oh yes, it's good. Now the affirmation for this month is I co-create with spirit, or I co-create through spirit, or I co-create next to spirit, some sort of preposition, co-creating in spirit. And I've spoken before about how that can be a bit misleading, this word co-create, especially with spirit, because as Ernest Holmes says, our whole foundation is oneness and unity. And co-create has duality built into it. I don't co-create with spirit, I am spirit, showing up as Larry. But there's another sense in which we can sort of think of co-creating, and that's I co-create with others. Right now, we're all co-creating this message. How I talk, when I look around, how I'm delivering it will depend on what I see your reaction is. We're all co-creating this message. As I said, Walt was co-creating everything with all of his employees. He thought of them all not as just worker bees, but as co-creators of Disneyland, of Snow White, of Mickey Mouse, of all the things that he created. If you have a business, you co-create that business with your employees and with your customers. If you are in a relationship, you're co-creating that relationship with the other people in it. And I say people because relationships are more than what we talk about relationships now, some sort of spousal relationship. You have a relationship with your parents, you have relationships with your employees, again, with the people that you hang out with your friends. Those are all relationships. And you co-create them with the other people in them. And so I would invite everybody here to think about what it is you're going to be creating in the next week. Later today, I'm going to be co-creating with the people that attended the workshop that I'm giving. Later in the week, I'll be co-creating a Facebook page. That's my intention. So think for a minute about what it is you're going to create over the coming week. And it doesn't have to be anything like a workshop or a Facebook page. Maybe you're going to be creating a family dinner. Maybe you're going to be creating a pleasant afternoon. Whatever it is, think about it for a moment, and then I'm going to count to 3, and then we're all going to say aloud, say your word, what it is you will create this week. So 1, 2, 3, I will create a Facebook page. Nobody said anything out loud. We're going to try it again. Let me be clear. Say out loud what it is you're going to be creating on the count of 3. And you don't have to say it so that other people can hear it. If you want it to be private, you can just mutter it to yourself. But on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. I will be creating a Facebook page this week. That's much better. You speak your word. You say it out loud. I will create according to my word. Abracadabra. And so it is.